Thank all of you coming. And this is quite a big honor to have Professor Liang coming here. First, I would introduce TechTalk. This is a quite important program in the Faculty of Engineering in Hong Kong U. So TechTalk is a series of forum and dialogues given by engineering researchers of diverse academic backgrounds to share their insights on innovation-related topics. Also, I think CH also give one, right? Yeah, some people also I give one. Okay, this time we have a Professor Liang Wing Mo coming here. He was an assistant director of HKO, the Hong Kong Observatory. His scope of work included, among others, weather forecasting, climate change, and climatology, as well as radiation monitoring and assessment. Currently, he is adjunct professor in CUHK. And here are some details I will not read through, but I don't know what is 武则天 about, 武则天. So it's maybe I will invite Professor Liang give more information about whatever he wants to see. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen. But I'm afraid what I'm going to share with you in the next 45 minutes is not living up to the expectation of tech talk. There is very little technical content, if any at all. I'm going to just share with you some stories about climate change and how it affects different peoples differently. So the title of my sharing is Unequal Burden of Climate Change. 10 years ago, there are some very young people here, probably don't know what happened in 2015. This is the sand sculpture of a little boy from Syria. There were some civil wars and disturbances in Syria, and so a lot of families escaped Syria, hopefully to reach the Western countries in Western Europe or whatever. So his family was trying to take a boat and go all the way to Greece. But before they arrived at Greece, they encountered some very nasty storms and waves and so on. So unluckily, he was drowned and his body was washed ashore. So when the tragedy occurs, he was just 2 years old. The importance of this photo or picture is that it is more than a number. A young boy died. As a matter of fact, these days we are very insensitive to numbers and statistics. Every day we hear about how many people died in Gaza, how many people died in Ukraine. We don't feel that much. We don't share the empathy. But I think this picture humanizes the tragedy, humanized what I would like to call the climate crisis. There are lots of reasons for the civil war to occur in Syria. Governance, repressive regime, economic difficulties, but there are other scholars, particularly climate scholars, who emphasize that climate change is one of the root causes of this Syrian refugee crisis. So let's take a look at the situation 10 years ago, 2015. In Syria, we have 7 million people displaced, either internally or externally. So they are trying every route across the northern part of Africa and then go through the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea and also the land route and so on. You can see that in one single day, thousands of people arrive here and there. But because the situation is getting out of control, so the land route becomes more and more difficult. You have blockage here and there. Okay, so the desperate people would try to, for example, the Allen's family try to go to Greece via the sea route. But in the case of Mediterranean, although it's not the largest of the oceans, they do encounter some what they call the rogue wave, very large waves, right? And as a result, they lost their life. And this is a simulation not of the rogue wave in Mediterranean, but a rogue wave in the Atlantic. That also occurred in the year 2015, when a cargo ship called El Faro was sunk because of the rogue wave. You can see that from the scale here, that this single wave here has a height of something like 15 meters or even higher. The reason for the rogue wave, and of course Professor Chen is an expert, I suppose, that wave, apart from tsunamis, waves are basically generated by winds. But the source of winds there could be multiple sources of winds. We may have a storm in the east, and then another cold front in the north, and so on. So there could be different winds driving waves moving in different directions. When the wave converge, and there is something what we call constructive interference. And that is the major reason why we have rogue wave, which is very high and very damaging. So this is a Syrian lady, a lucky lady, shall I say, that survived the seas and landed somewhere in Europe, maybe in Greece, I don't know. But if you look at her eyes, you probably feel that she is at a loss. And I use this photo and show it to my students in CUHK. And I ask them to describe the kind of feeling that this lady has at the moment when this picture was taken. And these are the words that the student used to describe this lady. You can see that she has suffered hardship, experienced death of her family and friends, misery, forlorn, dejection, despair, desperate, and above all, hopelessness. I think hopelessness is one of the greatest suffering of humankind. You know, in everyday life, throughout our life, we encounter difficulties of all kinds. And sometimes, although the situation is very difficult, if we see that there is light at the end of the tunnel, we can survive the situation. But for this lady, probably she did not see any light at the end of the tunnel. And I personally experienced this kind of hopelessness as a young child because, you know, except for Professor Chen, none of you have experienced the water shortage in the 1960s, right? And during that time, Hong Kong suffered a very severe drought. And everyone, even though I was a very small boy, hoped for rain day after day and day after day. And people actually prayed for the rain to come. And then your prayer and your hope, will be shattered the next day when the sun comes up as usual, hot and dry, day up, day in, day out. So this is a kind of hopelessness that sometimes drive people mad. As a result, as a matter of fact, I was in Australia in 2014 to do a documentary for Radio Television Hong Kong. We went to Queensland because knowing that Queensland suffered an 18-month drought. So we do a documentary and see how people fight against the drought. So we visited a number of farms, interviewed a lot of farmers, and as a matter of fact, when we read the newspaper every day, occasionally we read news that farmers took their own life, and this is simply because of hopelessness. So as a result, in 2015, the European Union identified the Syrian refugees as climate refugees because amongst a lot of reasons, climate is one of the factors. So let's delve in the climate change that occurred in that part of the world for the past 100 years or so. So this data are starting from 1900 to something like 2008. The upper graph here was the winter rainfall. Why do we plot the winter rainfall and not the annual rainfall? It's because in that part of the world, for example, in Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, the winter months, for example, December, January, and February are those months with the most rainfall. So it's completely opposite to the climate in Hong Kong. Right? In Hong Kong, we have most rainfall in summertime, but in Syria, the rainfall occurs in winter. So those are the months that they get most of the rainfall and they can grow the crops and so on and so on. And obviously, you can see a decreasing trend during the past 100 years or so. And the deficit in rainfall in the last couple of decades are particularly severe. But making the situation worse is that we have a rise in annual temperature. The temperature is rising simply as a result of global warming. So because of the fact that rainfall is decreasing and temperature is rising and more evaporation, then the PDSI, which is an index for drought, D stands for drought. So the drought index is getting worse and worse and worse. So some scientists describe the drought experience by Syria as the worst in 900 years. The worst in 900 years. So I repeat, the civil war in Syria is a result of many reasons. But climate change is one of the very important reasons. So in the old days, they called this region the Fertile Crescent, all right, including Syria, which is somewhere here, Palestine, and so on and so on. Because the shape of this area is like the crescent moon. In the old days, they have just sufficient rainfall to grow a lot of crops and so on and so on. So it's a piece of fertile land. But this piece of fertile lands can no longer grow sufficient food for the people there as a result of climate change. So these are some of the studies of the not the drought that caused a civil war in Syria, but the latest drought in 2020 to 2023. So there is a kind of research body called World Weather Attribution, which is a center where they study climate events or extreme weather events in all parts of the world and try to find out whether that particular extreme weather event is related to climate change. Now, it's important to note that extreme weather events occurred throughout the entire history of humankind. But the important thing is that because of human-caused global warming, we have more and more extreme weather events, which is attributable to climate change and global warming. So in one of the studies, it said that for the drought that will occur in Syria or the neighboring Iraq, if there is no climate change, then the kind of drought that occurred that led to the civil war is a 1 in 200 year event. So it should be a very, very rare event. if there is no global warming or climate change. But because the world has already warmed up by 1.2 degrees Celsius, well, actually it's more than 1.2 now as we speak, all right? Because of that little bit of global warming, that 50-year event becomes a 10-year event. So when we talk about global warming, we are not concerned about the rise of global temperature of 1 degree or 2 degrees. We are concerned about the occurrence of extreme weather like drought. So if the temperature continues to rise in the future and we reach a 2 degrees warming, then this 1 in 250 years event becomes a 5-year event. So that becomes a new normal. Drought in Syria, in Iraq, in the Fertile Crescent becomes a new normal. And that is a similar study also by World Weather Attribution that the drought that happened in Syria, if there's no climate change, shouldn't occur because it's normal conditions. But because of the rise in temperature, that normal condition becomes a very extreme drought. So we have to ask ourselves, who is the culprit? Who is the main culprit of this kind of human disaster? And if we're going to trace the history, then for the past 250 years, it is the USA, which has emitted the most of greenhouse gases. Well, I don't enter all the countries there, so just USA, Canada, China, and other countries and so on. This is per capita emission, because I think a lot of people are saying that, okay, China is the largest pollutant as far as greenhouse gas is concerned. But this is not a fair way to judge, because we have 1.4 billion people in China, right? So it's, whereas the population in the United States and other countries are much, much less. So we should use a per capita carbon dioxide emission. So even up to now, even up to date, the per capita emission in the United States and also in China, there is a very large gap between the two. So as far as per capita carbon dioxide emission is concerned, United States is still one of the worst culprit creating this global warming or climate change. And if we trace back to the history starting 250 years ago, the accumulated greenhouse gas emitted by United States is still the largest in all countries in the world, but quickly catching up by China. And you can see that Syria is something here. So that is a unit. For example, in China, we are emitting on the average about 7 to 8 tons every year for an average person. Here in Hong Kong, we emit about 4.5 tons every year. But for Syria, the average Syrian people emit somewhere around 1 ton per year. So they are the least responsible people causing climate change, but they bear the brunt of the crisis. Again, I have to emphasize that global warming or climate change is not the prime culprit, because as I said, extreme weather has been occurring for thousands and thousands of years. We have rainstorm thousands and thousands of years ago, drought, typhoons, and so on. But because of global warming, this is only explaining one facet of climate change. Because of global warming, the atmosphere can hold more water vapor. So when the meteorological conditions is right, then it can produce heavier rains, like what we experienced this year. We have 5 black rainstorms in a span of, I don't know, something like 10, 20 days. Okay, so this is some kind of extreme weather because we have more water vapor in the atmosphere. So when the water vapor, when the condition is right, then they can dump more water to the ground and then cause increased flooding and so on. But on the other end of the spectrum, if the weather condition is for a dry kind of weather to occur, then it will require more time for the atmosphere to build up its water content in order that clouds can form and rain can form, right? Because the atmosphere can hold more water, and it needs more water for it to become saturated. It has to be saturated before clouds can be formed, and then rain can be formed. So it will take a longer time to recharge the atmosphere, and therefore the drought will last longer, and it will be more severe. So the same phenomenon can cause two opposite extremes to occur at the same time. Of course, not at the same place, right? Heavy rain in Hong Kong and drought in Syria. Okay, so this is the kind of havoc that climate change is having on us. So, in very simple terms, global warming distorts our weather system, and when our weather systems are distorted, the extreme events can go even more extreme. So because of this change in our weather, we expect that, well, actually not we, is a study by a number of scientists and published in Nature a couple of years ago. We expect that by the year 2050, there will be a lot more climate refugees. And of course, whether or not we're going to have 100 million climate refugees or 50 million climate refugees depends on how we deal with the climate crisis. Also, we have three different scenarios: a pessimistic scenario, inclusive development, and more climate-friendly scenario. So in any case, even for the most optimistic scenario, we expect 51 million climate refugees by the year 2050. So that's going to be a big problem. If you remember the second slide, we have about 7 million people, all right, from Syria, fleeing to other countries. But by the year 2050, we have 51 million people all over the world. It will cause all kinds of problems. So the authors of this paper suggested that the rich country should try to help and support the poor country to fight against climate change so as to reduce the number of people affected by climate change and hopefully reduce the number of climate refugees. Okay, so this is the right way to deal with the problem. But let's look at how the wealthiest countries are doing. There is a report by a transnational institute or something like that called Global Climate War: How the World's Wealthiest Nations Prioritize Borders Over Climate Actions. These are the amount of money spent by USA every year to militarize the border with the sole objective of preventing refugees from coming into USA. So they're spending something like $20 billion every year to build walls and increasing the military people and so on, trying to stop people from coming into USA. Whereas on the other hand, this is the amount of money that is spent on climate change. All right, so these are other countries. The figure is more or less the same, and France is perhaps the most responsible countries in the sense that it spent more climate, it had more climate funds than the militarization fund. And this is another picture showing that the USA is the country that emitted the largest amount of greenhouse gases. So lots of social problems, international problems, refugee problems are arising as a result of water scarcity, like that occurs in Syria and other parts in other countries in the Middle East, as a matter of fact, also in Africa. So this is a projection by the World Resources Institute about water stress level in the middle of this century. So what is water stress? Because we have two variables. One is the change in water demand, and the other is the change in water availability. For example, in Hong Kong, we have something like 2,400 millimeters of rainfall every year. And then that amount of rainfall, annual rainfall, is projected to increase in the future by maybe 10%. Towards the end of the century. So we have more water availability. But perhaps we have more water demand as well, because our population will grow because of various demands of water and so on and so on. So we have to consider these two factors when we consider the water stress. So you can see that most of the countries with the highest water stress are those along the subtropical region. The northern part of Africa, the Arabian country, the Southern Asia, and so on. The reason is that as a result of climate change, the water availability all over the world can roughly be divided into 5 bands, with wet bands over the equator in the temporal regions, and the dry bands in the subtropical region. But unfortunately, because of the effect of climate change, the evaporation in the subtropical region will be transported to the temperate region. So that region becomes drier. Traditionally, it is a dry region. It will become drier as a result of climate change. So global warming is actually a redistribution of water resources. So we have to deal with that. In some countries, we have to deal with the floods are more frequent and more severe floods as a result of climate change. But in other countries, we have to deal with the drought as a result of the areas getting dry and dry, like here and like there. So when we talk about water scarcity, this is a very somber picture. A young African boy, I think he's a boy, scooping water from a water hole of mud water, right? It is something that, well, we in Hong Kong would never do it, because this kind of water appears disgusting to us. But this is perhaps the only source of water that this little boy can find in his vicinity. This is a picture telling us the harsh reality of the fact that the simple act of getting water to survive day in, day out will be at the expense of the mercy of Mother Nature. Okay, so this picture tells us that climate change is an issue that we should not and we cannot ignore. We have the same problem here in Hong Kong 60 years ago, in fact 62 years ago, and that is 1963, when we had one of the worst drought on record, and this is a rainfall record in the Hong Kong Observatory. This is 1963. We have less than 1,000 millimeter that year against the average of 2,400. So it was a very, very dry year. And that is a famous situation where we get water supply for 4 years, every 4 days. 4 hours of water supply every 4 days. But even then, we were much better than this little boy there. At least the water coming out from the tap was clean water, where we can wash our things and so on and so on. And then these are the years where we have water rationing, right? For those of you who were born after 1982, I think, you have never experienced water rationing. You were lucky. You are lucky, right? For those who are older than 40 years old, then they probably experienced this water rationing event. This is the last water rationing in Hong Kong. But isn't it interesting, if you look at this rainfall map here, rainfall chart here, the year 2011 is actually a very dry year. 2011 was very dry. But there is no water rationing. Why? Because we are not vulnerable. Because we can build a lot of structures such that we can have sufficient water supplies from other parts of China. For example, this one is Dongjiang. We have ducts and pipes and running more than 60 kilometers all the way from Dongjiang, right? And then these are the infrastructures. And also, I think we have just completed this, what they call the 西水東輸, the diversion of water from west to the east. This is Saigon West River, I think. So they are diverting the river from West River to the eastern part of the Pearl River estuary area. Because the West River, I think, Professor Chen will correct me if I am wrong, is the third largest river in China as far as the throughput is concerned. So we are pretty safe. Hong Kong is pretty safe. So that even for a very dry year, we don't need any water rationing. And experts in water management like Professor Chen and Professor Fred Lee here in Hong Kong said that we should be safe from water resources for the next, I don't know, 50 years, maybe longer. So that is the unequal burden of water security for those vulnerable people, for those vulnerable community. They don't have the resource to protect themselves against the nature's variability. But in Hong Kong, we have been pretty good in building our infrastructure, so we are pretty safe. And another unequal burden of climate change is how we face heat wave. You know, this year I think exceptionally hot. Even this month, before the cold surge, this 2 days, is exceptionally hot. I have never seen any abnormality. The temperature of October this year, every day, is about 4 degrees higher than the normal temperature. 4 degrees is a very, very large amount in terms of climatology. So the situation here is that this is our old climatology in terms of temperature. This is our new climatology. The mean temperature shifted by a very small amount, maybe about 1.5 degrees. But the significance is that we have a significantly larger areas of hot weather and also some extremely hot weather, right? And this is the extracted from the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. In the old days, when we don't have any climate change, more than 100 years ago, we still have drought. Now, because the temperature has risen by about 1 degree, then the frequency of drought is 5 times, nearly 5 times, as it was 150 years ago. If the temperature should rise to 2 degrees, then it's 14 times, 4 degrees, then it will be 40 times. It's not just the frequency that is increasing, it's the intensity of the heat wave is also increasing. So that is the most manifestable effect of global warming and climate change. But against the heat wave, you can see the very unequal burden. For the well-off people, they can create the climate that is suitable for survival, at least indoor, right? So for this mother and child, for this gentleman working in the office, they don't care how hot outside temperature is. They are well protected from the heat wave. But when, we have a lot of underprivileged people here in Hong Kong, and those working outdoors, they are exposed to the full impact of heat waves. And as a matter of fact, there is a study by Hong Kong U a couple of years ago that the estimated number of excess deaths in Hong Kong as a result of heat wave amount to more than 100 every year, more than 100 every year. That is very significant because if you compare with other extreme weather, like this year, we have 2 number 10 typhoon signals, right? No one was killed. No one was killed as a result of 2 number 10 signals. But for heat wave, we have more than 100. And even for 2023, we have more than 200 people dying as a result of the heat wave. And for the world as a whole, a lot of countries will have a lot of health problems arising from climate change. Of course, the most important is heat wave, represented by this color. And then they can have malnutrition problem, they can have a vector-borne disease problem like malaria, dengue fever, and so on and so on. And when there is flooding, they can have diarrhea diseases and so on and so on. So all these health problems, which are related to climate change, will increase the number of people dying from this kind of events. So the black dots are the people dying now. No, not now, I think it's 2030. And this one is 2050. So just 20 years apart, we have something like double the amount of people dying in Europe. And of course, in Africa, Middle East, and Asia, we have more people dying as a result of not direct impact of climate change, but indirect impact of climate change. Food security. Well, just talk about food security. We have, I don't know, more than 1 billion people who are undernourished. Right now, more than 1 billion people in the world. It's not a problem of that the world is not producing enough food for everyone. The problem is that the food is not shared equally among everyone. So we have enough food for everyone, but unfortunately not everyone has enough food. Now, because of that kind of problem, this is just one such story where some country, in particular Korea, Daewoo Logistics is one company in Korea who is what we call the climate, causing certain kind of climate apartheid, right? Probably for the young people, it doesn't mean a thing to you about what is apartheid. Apartheid is segregation of people in South Africa in the old days. The white people and the black people are segregated. They cannot go to school together and so on. So dividing the people, all right? But here we have climate apartheid. Some rich and powerful people of a country or companies like Daewoo Logistics is doing something that protect their own people on one hand, but then burden the other people in other countries so that the extent of inequality, the gap between the people become larger and larger. And that is what they call the climate apartheid. One such story is that this country tried to buy or rent 1.3 million hectares of agricultural land for 99 years for the purpose of growing corn and palm oil so that they can exclusively export to Korea. Okay, so this is the way that Korea and this company, they will try to protect their own people at the expense of the people in Madagascar. And of course, perhaps in Ukraine and Myanmar and so on. So this event, this kind of phenomenon of climate apartheid is getting worse and worse as climate change becomes more and more serious. So it's just like in the old days, scramble for Africa. You know, in the old days, Africa was basically entirely colonized by European countries, right? Within just a span of 3 years, colonization of Africa increased from 10% to more than 90% within 3 years, because they tried to scramble whatever was there, whatever resources was there in Africa. It could be human resource, it could be natural resource, right? So all the European countries try to cut Africa into small partitions so that they can grab whatever they can. So climate apartheid is just like the scramble for Africa in the old days, except that it is not just happening in Africa. It is happening in other underdeveloped countries in other parts of the world. So climate apartheid is that the wealthy, polluting nation insulate themselves from the consequences of its consumption and climate change. And then the people in those countries are getting the brunt of the climate change. And even in China, there are farmers, subsistence farming in China, where they depend on the crop yield, and because of climate change and extreme weather, the crop yield will decrease in the future. So this is a paper suggesting that different people in China could cause, the income and wages will change, some with increase in wages, some with a decrease in wages as a result of climate change. So that will cause a kind of income inequality. And I don't know how much time do I have. What is the time right now? So I'm more or less overrun. So I'm going to very quickly go through the last unequal burden of climate change. Is gender disparity, right? And we talk about refugees. We'll talk about climate refugees. And life of climate refugees is, of course, very difficult. But life of female climate refugees is even worse, even worse. You remember the lady with kind of hollow eyes and things like that, right? At the very beginning of this sharing. She arrived at some kind of refugee camps in Greece. Those camps, although they are kind of physically safe, but the ladies in the camps are such that they were afraid to go to the bathroom during the night because of sexual assault and things like that. So because of the fact that management of this kind of camp is so difficult that all kinds of crimes can occur. And the victims of those crimes are predominantly female because they are not able to fight against the one who instigated the crime. Under climate change, life is getting more and more difficult. And one way, the family, right, or the parents, to kind of, I mean, I don't know, solve the problem or what, is that they try to get the girls, their daughters, married at a very young age. So this little girl is actually 13 years old, and she already had the burden of raising her own child. So she was married at 13 years old and has to take up all the responsibility as a wife and as the daughter-in-law of another family, and so on. So, you know, you can imagine the kind of difficulty that a young girl like her has to go through, because I can feel that for myself. My granddaughter is now 11 years old. I can't imagine my granddaughter marrying at the age of 13 and going through all this difficulty at such a young and tender age. And then, under the context of climate change, female has larger or worse health burden. So this is a study by Carbon Brief, and in every icon here, there's different extreme weather events or different diseases and so on. So if you go to this website and click into one of those bubbles, then you can find the result of a certain study about the health, which is related to climate change. So for example, for this one in Guangzhou, China, a study in China found that exposure to high temperatures increase preterm birth risk. So preterm birth risk occurs only for female, right? Male would never have suffered this kind of health burden. If you go to some other part, this one is a study in Italy. It said that exposure to hot summer temperature increased the risk of preterm birth. So it's the same, all right, whether it's in China or in Italy. And the higher risk of malaria. That, I mean, sounds strange to me. Why is it that women were at higher risk of malaria? Probably because of the fact in those countries, for example, in Africa, the women stay at home doing the household work and also do the farming. Right? In Africa, it's the women who are doing most of the farming, and the men will go to maybe factory or things like that. All right? Maybe raising cattle and so on and so on. So women has a high risk of contracting malaria in Ethiopia and miscarriage in Malaysia and so on. So if we study the health burden of all people all over the world, we'll find that it is the female who suffered maybe the cases, 70% of the cases of health problem. And the other is, of course, the lack of water. We saw the picture of a little boy getting the mud water for survival, as if it is the lifeline. And then in those countries, in particular in Africa, in India, it is the women and the girls, I mean, the responsibility of getting water for daily use falls on the shoulders of women and girls. But because of climate change, because of occurrence of drought and so on, they might have to walk a much longer distances in order to get sufficient water for the household use. And for every extra mile that the girl has to take, right, in order to get the water, is a step away from learning, play, and safety. So the women, the girls, will be suffering from this kind of problem. This is an acronym. I don't know if you have ever come across this acronym before. VAWG, right? Whoever had the answer, well, what should I do? I'll buy you a drink, right? VAWG. No one want to try. It's very difficult. It is violence against women and girls. Even in civilized places like here, where is it? It is in Leeds, UK. All right. There is a large mural in Leeds, in UK, against asking the women to speak up against VAWG, violence against women and girls. What has it to do with climate change? Well, study shows that as temperature rises, so does the rate of gender-based violence. And that occurs in UK, occurs in other parts of the world, civilized parts of the world, developed part of the world, and also underdeveloped part of the world. For example, in rather backward countries like Kiribati, this is a country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I was there in 2011, again doing the documentary for RTHK. So you have about 1/4 of the situation where women and girls suffer as a result of violence, domestic violence. And then Papua New Guinea, 30%, and Congo, more than 30%. So these people, I mean, women and girls suffer from domestic violence every now and then. But the situation is getting worse and worse as a result of climate change. And this is some statistics in Canada. And you can see that these are 2 different years, 2023 and 24. The rate, I mean the number of this kind of domestic violence occurs mostly in the summer months, in the months where the temperature is high. So women, although all people, has to bear the consequence of climate change. Some people, here in this case, is the ladies who bear the brunt of climate change. So this is my last slide. Just a couple of weeks ago, I think it's 2 or 3 weeks ago, you have the UN General Assembly in New York. And this guy spent more than half an hour talking about climate change, right? He said that USA is going to withdraw from the fake Paris Agreement. How come Paris Agreement is fake? Nearly 200 countries signed Paris Agreement. It is not fake. Whereby America pays so much more than every other country. This is true, but it is the right thing to do because there is a principle under the United Nations framework for climate change, which is common but differentiated responsibility as far as climate change is concerned. Everyone has a responsibility. But because you pour the most carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, USA has the largest responsibility to support the other people in other countries. So it's the right thing to do. But you are not compelled to do that. All right? No one forces you to do that. You can pay whatever you like. So this is not kind of a compulsory thing, more like an obligation. Climate change is the greatest con job ever perpetrated. This is nothing further from the truth. You can say that climate change is the greatest con job. It is the greatest con job perpetrated by the fossil fuel industry. Why do I say that? Because the fossil fuel industry themselves hired scientists to study climate change 40 years ago. And the result of the study is that continuing burning fossil fuel will aggravate the climate situation. So they knew that more than 40 years ago, but then they cover up the scientific findings. So it is true that climate change is the greatest con job, but not the scientists, not the climate scientists nowadays, but rather the fossil fuel industry. So my last word is that we have a lot to talk about climate change. But I have the feeling that here in Hong Kong, we live the life as if we do not believe in climate change. Donald Trump is an outright denier of climate change. His words, his action speaks for his words, or his words speaks for his action. But here in Hong Kong, I know that, I suspect that more than 99% of us know that climate change is happening. But we live a lifestyle as if climate change is not happening. So this is something that we should reflect upon ourselves. Thank you, Professor CHEN.
Yes, thank you, thank you.